Welcome to a special Navigating Net Zero mini-series. Navigating Net Zero in Focus, Developments in Climate Standards and Guidance. In this mini-series, your host Alexia Kelly sits down with the leadership of many of the foremost climate accounting and reporting bodies to get the latest on this fast-moving, sometimes confusing space. Together, they get to the bottom of what each of these standards does, what they're doing to rise to the moment, and why it's so important to get all of this right. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive right in.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another episode of Navigating Net Zero, the podcast where we dig into what's working, what's not, and what's next on our global journey to net zero. This is part of our special series we're doing on greenhouse gas accounting standards and the rapidly evolving landscape of alphabet soup that we find ourselves swimming through on a regular basis. I am delighted to be joined here today with my friend and colleague, Chris Davis. Chris has joined us before, but has spent nearly 2 decades at the forefront of climate policy, corporate sustainability, and carbon markets. Before joining my team at the High Tide Foundation as a senior fellow, he led Amazon's international sustainability policy work, helped shape global greenhouse gas accounting standards, and served as Governor Jay Inslee's climate and energy policy advisor in the state of Washington in the United States for many years. There, he worked to advance landmark clean energy and carbon pricing legislation, and today he helps lead the Task Force for Corporate Action Transparency, or what we affectionately call TCAT, working to strengthen transparency and accountability in corporate climate action. Chris, thanks so much for joining me.
It's great to be here again, Alexia. Thank you for the invitation.
So we're going to jump right in. We really want to dig into helping our listeners understand the role that the various standard setting bodies out there play. TCAT is obviously one of the new kids on the block when it comes to greenhouse gas accounting. And certainly when we were earlier considering, and I guess in the interest of full disclosure, I should say I serve as the board chair and kind of one of the key proponents of the work that we do at TCAT. That work was really intended to fill some specific gaps that we were seeing coming from our vantage point as former corporate practitioners and sustainability executives working to implement greenhouse gas policy and try and use these standards in the real world. So, Chris, tell us a little bit about, what TCAT is, what problem it's trying to solve, and why it matters for corporate sustainability professionals.
Yeah, absolutely. Great place to start. TCAT began really as an sort of informal dialogue among corporate sustainability practitioners, yourself, myself, a whole cohort of our colleagues across at the time, a number of different corporations who were positioned to sort of play a leadership role in climate. We were all, I think, grappling with kind of a fundamental challenge of how we encouraged and built the case for companies to take corporate climate action inside when the accounting guidance that companies were typically using to quantify those actions, report those actions, count them towards targets was, as you said, sort of full of a lot of gaps at the time. And I think many of us were experiencing the state of that guidance as a real blocker, a real impediment to building the case internally to take on new actions and take on new goals. The standards have come a long way since those early conversations a few years back. I'm sure we'll talk about that today. But at the time, we were dealing with, as you said, gaps, just sort of holes and the companies needed filled about how to report certain kinds of activities. The standards themselves were vastly outdated, right? Most of what we were looking at the time and using to kind of guide our thinking were documents that were 15, 20 years old. And one of the great bright spots, I think, in our world over the last 4 or 5 years is the number of instruments and pathways and strategies that have opened up that allow companies to take action in ways that really they weren't thinking of doing 5, 6, 8, 9 years ago, using different kinds of market instruments and otherwise. And the standards themselves hadn't kept up on those. They were really outdated. And that's where some of those gaps came from. So in some ways, the incumbents, the kind of default guidance that we all used had been kind of outpaced by the kinds of things that companies had wanted to do. And it was really holding us back. They were unclear about how to make claims on things, how to sort of substantiate what was true from what was more dubious. And so all of that created risk for companies, and I think really kind of impeded progress. So that original conversation became an initiative over time as several of us moved into different roles. We kept working with those corporate groups that expanded to include a range of different NGOs as well as climate leading companies who have been working with us on that initiative. We set forward really to kind of tackle that the problem statement really being kind of the lack of clear guidance for accounting and reporting was holding companies back. We put heads together and pen to paper to sort of draft what we thought needed to kind of fill those gaps. again, at a time when the consultations and the updates and reforms that we've seen hadn't really begun yet. And we then moved forward into kind of an opportunity to sort of turn that into a document, which we released as a new guidance framework last September. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. So that early days of informal conversation have turned into kind of a formal initiative that now has a cross-section of leading companies, NGOs, a senior advisory board of some of the great GHG accounting experts around the world, and a list of NGO endorsers who help support and kind of give guidance and direction to that work as it goes forward.
Yeah, and just to double click on the risk point that you were making, because I think it's really important. It was certainly something that I grappled with in my last role as we were struggling to talk about the various things that we were doing to reduce our emissions. And the lawyers and our auditors said, well, you really need third-party guidance to report on these things, right? So all the work we were doing to deploy electric vehicles on the productions that we had at Netflix, and the work that we were doing to decarbonize our electricity and invest in new innovative technologies to help bring new technologies to market, all of those kind of that essential decarbonization work we were doing, I couldn't find guidance to point to externally from a credible third party that helped me understand how I reported on that in my ESG report. And this was a number of years ago now, but the lawyers in particular said, look, it's really important to have things well substantiated. And the assurance providers, so the big fours of the world, the EYs and Deloittes who do the assurance of these numbers, said there's nothing for us to use to assure these numbers against. And this was specifically around the mitigation actions, right? So right now you can get your corporate inventory assured using the greenhouse gas protocol, which is what most people do. But there is big white space around getting that third-party assurance for your mitigation actions. I know we're going to dig into what the TCAT guidance specifically covers. But I think then it was a concern. Now in the United States, it's even more of a concern. The anti-ESG backlash and the pressure that companies are under, both from folks who are really interested in seeing them not take action at all, and from, the far left who have very specific ideas about what that action should look like and what credible climate action is and is not, has created sort of this pressure cooker for companies where we're really seeing a pullback from wanting to talk about this stuff at all. And I think one of the core goals we had when we were putting TCAT together was to build that basic transparency infrastructure and to help provide that third-party assurable guidance so that we could keep companies both engaged in the work, moving ahead, and talking about the work publicly.
Yeah, I think that's well said. The assurability piece has been crucial from the early start. So the unlock that I think TCAT really focuses on, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of the expansion of the number of standards that are out there and where the TCAT guidance kind of fits within that landscape. But the real focus for TCAT, as you said, has always been on clarifying the quantification and reporting of mitigation actions. And so, yes, of course, it's critical that we have clear guidance on how you report your emissions and how those emissions change over time. But without the story about what companies are doing to lower those emissions and to report those actions credibly and to be able to clearly, as you say, consistently and transparently report those, there's a disconnect there. And that's really the gap that TCAT set out to fill. That was the unlock that we thought would both motivate more corporate action and also help direct and steer institutional capital towards decarbonizing technologies, which is also obviously kind of the big goal of the whole effort. I think it boils down to be, I think the guidance is really aimed at doing three things, and you've touched on them: help companies credibly, transparently, consistently quantify and report those mitigation actions in a way that ultimately they can take credit for them. Do that in a way that's auditable and insurable. We've heard that assurable. We've heard that again and again from companies. If you can't take this guidance to a third party, disinterested body to help validate and substantiate those, then again, you've got a real barrier in terms of the incentive that you're creating. And then also, ultimately help companies with the reporting that they owe through a growing number of public disclosure requirement programs. So regulations are forcing companies to do more of this reporting. And when they operate in multiple different jurisdictions, they face differing reporting regulations. And so part of what TCAT enables us to do, again, with that transparency, consistency, is help companies report into these different frameworks the upside of what they're doing to address their emissions.
Yeah, and I know you spent a lot of time navigating the alphabet soup of disclosure regulations, both in key kind of international markets and in your last role. Say a few more words just about how having that consistent guidance can help make it easier for companies who are sort of staring at this crazy patchwork of disclosure requirements across different markets.
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge that companies have grappled with really more in the last 5-8 years of, as I think on the one hand, disclosure programs have grown, and this is a good thing, right? I mean, we're looking to companies to disclose not only the risks that their operations face or the risks that their operations help drive as a result of their activity, the way that they are affected by and drive climate change, but then increasingly how they report the actions that they're undertaking to mitigate those risks, both their exposure to climate disasters or other kinds of drivers that would affect their business operations. And also, as we say, kind of what they're doing to lower those risks over time. And I think that becomes a really crucial opportunity to sort of help companies differentiate themselves from their competitors about what they're doing in their products and their services. But this diversity of this, right? You have large companies who have operations in different countries, who operate as subsidiaries, who are operating with supply chains spread across the world. And so seeking ways for big corporations with that kind of distribution of their networks around the world to be able to aggregate data, to simplify the act of pulling that together and to tell a consistent story from place to place that on the one hand helps them communicate what they're doing, but also doesn't expose them to risk of deception or fraud or greenwashing, which are kind of the standard things that companies are dealing with when they debate whether to be more or less transparent about what they're doing. A consistent framework for how you regularly show those actions, how you quantify them, get them out is just a critical piece to sort of enabling companies to do that more.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 2 guidance documents that TCAT has published, one of which was recently updated. Can you just explain what each of those guidance documents is and does and how they've changed between the first version and the most recent one?
Yeah, so in September last year, as part of Climate Week, we released, as you said, 2 guidance documents, the Mitigation Action Reporting Guidance, which we affectionately call the MAARG, the Targeted Action Reporting Guidance, which we call the TARG. And these are really, again, kind of designed to help quantify and report mitigation, to do this in a consistent way. So the MAARG is a rule-based framework that allows companies to basically take any mitigation action. Its strength is really, it's sort of agnostic to the nature of the mitigation action. It just simply says, if you're going to do this, this is how you quantify it, this is how you report it. The TARG is a sort of complementary document that provides a set of templates that allow you to then take what's reported in the MAARG and translate those into standardized reports that can be used for, again, financial reporting, sustainability reporting, ultimately disclosure and public regulatory disclosure programs. What the MAARG really enables a company to do is to follow a very kind of rule-based set of tests that you can apply to any given mitigation action. And the kind of results of those tests, as you kind of work through the logic structure, gives you direction as to where to put those into what we call a multi-statement framework. And the multi-statement framework is really kind of the heart and soul of the MAARG. We're seeing this kind of approach to distinguishing and separating your mitigation actions into different reporting statements emerge in a lot of places right now. It's central to the greenhouse gas protocols revisions. We're seeing it in ISO. It's a component of our friends' work at the Green Markets Activation Organization within the AIM guidance. When we started this process, there weren't many of these frameworks around. And so there's really been sort of a convergence and a coalescing around the value of this. Why is it valuable? Because it allows companies to make important distinctions about whether a mitigation action is part of their inventory, whether it's done outside of their inventory. And again, it brings consistency to this and allows companies to separate different actions that are accounted for using different accounting techniques in different places. That brings consistency. It builds trust. It allows companies to really sort of show their work. And the multi-statement framework has kind of been the heart and soul then of the guidance document and what we've built the structure around.
Yeah, and just 2 more words on the value of multi-ledger or multi-statement structure is that it enables us to just be a lot clearer about where various climate impacts and actions are showing up. And I often hear sort of an oversimplification where, if it's in your inventory, it's going to show up in your inventory and it's a real reduction. And if it's not in your inventory, then we may or may not trust it. It may or may not be good. And we're not really sure about that related to targets or anything else. And the deeper that I get into this world of parsing and accounting for mitigation actions, both as they pertain to inventories and supply chains, and as they pertain to kind of all of the other mitigation actions and opportunities we have out in the rest of the world, it's increasingly clear to me that there is no one perfect accounting system, and you can have really bad accounting inside of inventories. You can have really bad accounting outside of inventories, and having really strong rules and governance and oversight that is underpinned by transparency is fundamentally important to making sure that we can build this space into a credible engine for capital allocation and ultimately scaled action. And the inspiration, I think, on the TARG, for me anyways, really came from our experiences in Paris and negotiating the architecture there, where you have your national inventory that you're reporting, and then you have a whole separate kind of adjustment conversation and ledger system that enables you to reflect international emissions trading and market-based actions. For companies that are seeking to supply to decarbonize their scope 3 value chains, right, which are distributed usually across a whole bunch, many different suppliers, really trying to come up with a coherent strategy and accounting system for tracking the impact of all of those, it turns out is not nearly as straightforward as I think some have made it out to be. And so this work, I think, is really helping to align the reporting and transparency systems that should underpin all of these systems in a sort of policy neutral way with some of the international architecture that's been so painstakingly negotiated and put in place over the last 15 years or so. And also hopefully should enable companies to feel a lot more comfortable to take action, sort of no matter where that action sits. And I know that's something that we talk a lot about, but I'm just, especially in your last role, I know the role of market-based accounting in particular is both controversial and complicated and also quite necessary. So maybe just talk a little bit about how that fits into this work that we've been doing at TCAT and how you see it contributing to our broader decarbonization efforts from a corporate perspective.
Yeah, this idea, we talk about this a lot. I think one of the great kind of consistent pieces of feedback we've been hearing from companies to the first pilot and into the second pilot, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment, has been the value that TCAT has created in exactly teasing out that distinction that you were talking about. The greenhouse gas accounting systems that we inherited have always put a huge focus on measuring and estimating the emissions in a company's inventory, right? Your carbon footprint, as you say.
At least on a voluntary basis.
At least on a voluntary basis, that's right. And that sounds like it's all we would need to sort of measure what a company does, right? There's your footprint. Those are the things you emit. Now, what are you doing to try to lower those emissions as you've characterized them in your footprint? It turns out, and we hear about this from companies all the time, that counting something only if it immediately affects your inventory and drives down the things is great. It's important. We need to see that. But it leaves a lot of really important mitigation on the table, because a lot of what we ask companies to do, a lot of the largest scale opportunities they have to invest are in opportunities that maybe transform the sectors that they operate on, but don't touch the same companies that they buy from or that they sell to, or aren't within the same value chain relationship. And so by really creating a system that prioritizes and incentivizes companies to act on their inventories, you're doing a couple of things. You're closing off a lot of important things that we want to do. And you're creating a dynamic that many of us have been caught into for a number of years, which is you try to squeeze more things into that bucket that are eligible to be counted, find more ways that market instruments that we're using can be counted towards those inventory goals. And that leads to lots of confusion in the accounting systems. It creates, frankly, kind of risky rule sets because it makes it a little bit opaque, whether you've really made something happen or whether you're responsible for it or whether somebody else might also be claiming it. These are some of the risks that we have around market-based systems, which our good accounting practices can manage for. But until TCAT and others started putting these multi-statement frameworks together, a lot of that was kind of lumped together. Everyone was trying to drive all that stuff into the inventory. So one of the, I think, great contributions that TCAT is trying to make is to sort of tease those things apart. And that means a couple of things, right? It means you might be looking at different measures of your progress. You might be looking at some measures that are focused on your inventory. You might be setting up other measures to reflect your progress towards decarbonizing the sectors you operate on. Maybe you have a goal associated with helping to just drive global decarbonization. There's lots of ways companies may be choosing to take targets. And if the only thing we're giving them credit for is when that one particular target moves, again, we're not creating the incentives that we want. This comes up a lot when we draw analogies between the carbon world of accounting and the financial world. We're quite accustomed to having, a ledger system or a set of metrics in the financial world that together reflect a company's health. Everyone understands that there's a balance sheet, that there's a cash flow statement, that there's an income statement, and those are telling different but complementary stories about a company's health. And similarly, there are different metrics, right? There's a return on equity metric, or there's an earnings before taxes, or there's a net profit margin. I mean, these are all things that companies use to tell stories and help understand the nuance of their financial position, the health, and where they're at. And we don't have any problem sort of, swallowing all that complexity and understanding that they are helpful. We need to get there on carbon management. And some of our company partners are in this boat. They would like to see all their progress synthesized in one number, but that really forces you either to distill a lot of complex activity into sort of, one set of reports, or allow yourself to kind of tell your story in a variety of different ways. And that's what TCAT really enables.
Yeah, well said. And I think the alignment and corollary to financial market accounting and systems is a really important one, because in order for this whole space to kind of grow up and move towards increasingly consolidated and hopefully harmonized global rule sets that we're pointing to, A, we have some work to do, but B, we really need to be able to speak the language of finance and capital markets. And this was particularly, I'm sure you experienced this too, briefing your senior executives at Amazon. But, when I was at Netflix talking to the CEO or the CFO, trying to explain the governance of voluntary climate action to non-experts is an incredibly challenging thing to do. And so the more that we can make this system kind of walk and talk like the systems that they are used to dealing with, which is exactly as you're saying, financial statements, income statements, cash flow statements. How are we reconciling those, thinking about them? That's really only going to serve us in the long term. And I think actually is not just a thing that might be nice to do someday, but is actually a real imperative for our space. I want to be clear about one thing though on TCAT is that, and just to clarify, is TCAT telling companies what they're allowed to count, or is it just telling them how to count for the different things that they're doing? And what's the distinction there?
TCAT tells companies how to quantify and report their emissions, full stop. But that creates a really critical, important foundation layer. It doesn't say these kinds of actions can or should count towards these kinds of goals, or that these kinds of actions should be carried out in a way that reflects a certain set of quality criteria, or necessarily, that those actions have certain attributes about them or certain conditions around them. It doesn't get into that. It simply says, if you choose to do those things, where should they be reported in a way that is consistent so that people can understand how they were qualified and where they've gone. What that does is leave open the opportunity for other standards bodies, for other organizations to come in and say, once you've established that reporting framework, which things should count towards this goal, or which things should eligibly count towards this target? If we're interested in these types of actions by a company, how should they be evaluated in the world? What should their additionality be? What should their other quality criteria to be? Those are things that other organizations can begin to layer on, but without a foundation of sort of how this gets quantified and reported first, we're sort of left immediately churning with those much more what we call sort of policy decisions. TCAT really works to be as agnostic about policy as possible and just create that sort of foundational layer that other standards that can then build on top of to do that target work.
So could I use the TCAT templates and guidance to, for example, report progress towards my science-based target?
You could do that. You would need a set of rules that come from your science-based target standard that tell you sort of which actions count, which ones don't. Are there temporal boundaries that should be applied to a particular action? Do you need to link an emission to the time that you actually intervened around it? Are there spatial geographic boundaries that help define whether a activity in location A can be related to an emission in location B? Those are guidance rules and sort of quality criteria or eligibility criteria that TCAT doesn't develop. But what you can use it for is to sort of establish the range of things that you've done in that consistent way, and then work with your target standards to understand how they relate to your particular target under the rules of that target standard you've decided to use.
Totally agree. There's one also thing that TCAT does that I think is quite different from the way in which inventories are currently calculated and mitigation actions are allocated in most systems that exist today. And this is to differentiate between things that are mitigation actions and outcomes and things that we call inventory adjustments. So maybe just talk about that distinction.
This is another area that we've heard a lot from companies about. Again, going back to what I said earlier about, kind of the origins, the system that we inherited is really heavily focused on a company's footprint and its inventory. And so obviously drives companies to take actions that presumably change that inventory. As it turns out, a lot of things can change that inventory. They may or may not be a result of things that companies have done. Unfortunately, we're sitting in a sort of wartime moment right now with what's happening in the Middle East. Global airlines who are thinking about their obligations to mitigate emissions within the current global aviation framework saw a significant dip in emissions because flights got changed as a result of the war. Right? Recessions have the same effect on emitting companies, where suddenly forecasts aren't upheld, companies ramp back and their emissions go down. Many of the companies that we work with evaluate their Scope 3 emissions using models. It's the easiest way to sort of report that data is not to measure or try to measure every indirect emission that your suppliers are involved in, but to basically model those using spend, how much a company spends, and then multiplying those by emissions factors. All of those things mean that there are drivers and forces that can change numbers in your inventory that are a result of nothing that you did as a company. They can cut both ways, right? That can make you look better. It can make you look worse. But either way, it poses a challenge to companies who want to differentiate themselves from their competitors on their carbon performance. And so one of the things TCAT did is create a set of rules that allow you to characterize when a change in your inventory or a global impact that you've had is a result of something that you directly caused as a company or an investment that you directly made from those other things where your numbers might be changing as a result of things that you didn't have any responsibility for. And again, that cuts both ways. It helps you call out the times when the inventory changes as a result of the economy. It also allows you to shine a light on the very specific contributions that you are solely responsible for. First time that's really been done, it's a real, again, sort of shortcoming of over-indexing to the inventory changes as the only number that really matters. TCAT isn't arguing that that isn't important or that we shouldn't be tracking inventory numbers. It's just trying to say that resting all of our judgment on whether a company is doing enough on that number is not a sufficient way to go.
I completely agree. And I think that one of the things that is really challenging is this prevailing wisdom that the inventory is this infallible reflection of action. And in fact, it's quite fallible. And to your point, is often reflecting things that I may or may not have had anything to do with as a corporate sustainability executive. And so there is a world, particularly as sectors start to decarbonize, where we will hopefully start to see inventory numbers go down, ideally substantially over time. And those companies may or may not be doing anything to actually help make that happen. And so because things are decarbonizing, because we're having more renewable energy deployed into the sector. And so as we're thinking about incentivizing and kind of giving credit where credit is due, being able to differentiate the impacts, the mitigation outcomes in the world that I've driven as a company because I made it an investment. I bought the more expensive green premium product. I invested in that renewable energy project, like to get credit for that. You actually have to have a way to sort of separate that out from everything else that's happening in my inventory, which to your good point earlier, are mostly just estimated and modeled numbers. You need a system that can help you parse a little more granularly. And so that definitely was a lot of the impetus there as well, because we want to understand what's happening with companies' inventories, but we also need to understand how all the things they're doing or not are impacting that inventory. And so this sorting hat exercise and this very large spaghetti chart, sort of flow chart that we've developed with the series of tests to help you figure out what fits where, is intended to help provide that additional level of transparency and clarity as people are looking at and evaluating, okay, what did I do? How well did it work? Thanks for walking through both of those things. So what's TCAT been up to since its launch in last September?
We have been very busy. So as you mentioned, we launched, again, these two guidance documents at Climate Week in September. Very quickly after that, we initiated the first of two pilot phases. We worked with in our first pilot phase, which ran last autumn and up through the holiday season, we worked with about 15 companies to really kind of take the guidance out for a drive and figure out how it works. Run real world mitigation actions through the tests, work with companies on the reporting statements, explore the reporting templates that are in TARG, hear from companies about what it was like to actually run some of their historical data through this and get a sense from them sort of what did they learn from that? What can we learn for updates? So we undertook that. We wrapped that up. We got feedback on that by the end of the year, by January, and we took that feedback into the design of a second pilot, which is underway right now, or in fact, with some of the work streams within that second pilot just kind of starting to wrap up, and we could talk about sort of that. In addition, we took the feedback we got from that first pilot phase, and we used it to do an update on the initial draft guidance. So we released a version 1.1 update of the guidance last spring. We currently have a public consultation out for that. So we're inviting folks from the NGO community and the broader business community to look at those changes and to give us feedback on those before we sort of settle them. But at the same time, as I mentioned, we're continuing to evolve it. So we've taken the feedback in that first pilot and used it to design some changes into our second pilot. I mentioned that TCAT is designed very much to be sort of both scope and sector agnostic, right? So we're thinking about best practices for quantifying and reporting mitigation. That mitigation can be directed at your scope 1 emissions, your scope 3 emissions. It should be robust to all different sectors. There were a few exceptions to that. We have a caveat in the first document that we weren't able to really account for the financial sector. There are some special needs and considerations within that sector that TCAT wasn't quite ready to take on. And we got some feedback in that first pilot that there were a handful of sectors that really could benefit from some sort of deeper dive. And so two of those were the lands sector, which is inclusive of both agricultural communities as well as forestry companies, and electricity sectors. And particularly within the electricity sector, companies that were interested in a new way of accounting or additional way of accounting from kind of the traditional attributional approaches and wanted to explore how to use what we call impact accounting to gauge their work. So our second pilot does a kind of deep dive in those two sectors. We're delighted to have now about 30 companies across both pilots working, as well as about 12 to 14 major NGOs who have also joined that and provide an NGO civil society perspective on those challenges as well. And so we're taking the input from both of those kind of work streams right now, and we'll be wrapping that up and using it to issue either some supplemental work or potentially a new version of guidance later on this winter.
And we're also doing a public consultation, right?
Yes, I think I mentioned that. But yeah, after we released our version 1.1 in the spring, we went ahead and released a public consultation on that. It's out at the moment and available. We're inviting both companies and NGOs, anyone with expertise in the area, to give us feedback on that first version 1.1 draft that we developed.
Great. And what comes next for TCAT as we've continued to engage with the broader corporate ecosystem and standard setting space?
Well, the first thing is we're really, I think, digesting what we've learned from these pilots and trying to figure out exactly what the best contribution we can make, especially within these sector areas, to kind of creating, again, additional clarity that the companies need within these sectors to move forward. There were a handful of positives that we got out of the pilot phase. Simplicity and clarity has really paid off. We brought a lot of clarity to just what's often been a very jargon-filled kind of a world. We helped get sort of the multi-statement framework into play, and now there's, I think, work to be done to figure out how we support companies in applying that and bringing it over and beginning to use it. We helped to, I think, as I mentioned, kind of create this more clear distinction about how things that should be accounted for attributionally and things that are accounted for consequentially might be managed cleanly and separately from each other. At the same time, there's a handful of kind of critical feedback pieces that we got too. The reporting statements that we put together in TARG are very detailed. They ask for a lot of information about companies' use of environmental attribute certificates so that those are well substantiated. We've heard some ways that we can clean those up and streamline them. And so we're doing work to do that right now. We hear a lot from companies about the necessity of claims guidance. What that means is sort of more certainty about once you've reported something somewhere, what can you actually say about it publicly? We want to be careful about our role in that versus the standards, but there's work that we can do to kind of clarify what it means to be in a particular reporting statement. So we're thinking a little bit about that. And we're thinking about these sort of sector-specific supplementary documents that we want to do across both lands and electricity.
And since you raised consequential and attributional, I think it might be useful to just spend a couple minutes on this distinction, because I get asked regularly by other experts, like, wait, what is this again? And what's the difference? So maybe you do your version and I'll do my version of what is attributional and what is consequential accounting, and why are they both so confusing and so important?
The way that I try to organize this or explain it to my family, folks that don't necessarily live in this world, attributional accounting is really what we use to track changes in our emissions and that carbon footprint, that inventory that we talked about. We account for things by basically evaluating the carbon associated with different products or services or activities within our supply chain, and we add those things up. And together they give us an accounting of how many tons of greenhouse gas emissions have been released into the atmosphere as a result of what I as a company does, what I buy, what I make, what I purchase from my suppliers, what my customers do with my product, how they dispose of it at the end. So it's quite a comprehensive sort of, floor to ceiling, beginning to end kind of view of your atmospheric contributions of your activities as a company. As such, it's important, it's critical, and it is sensitive to some of the things companies do. If you switch from buying, a steel input from a carbon intensive company to a less carbon intensive company, that should show up in your inventory as a lower number that will help demonstrate that you've taken an action that lowers your company's particular contributions to atmospheric warming. Does the atmosphere feel a change in that? We're not sure, because if that provider just goes and sells that product to somebody else, maybe not. If it decreases their market share and they can't get any business to replace it, then maybe that's a change that the atmosphere actually experiences. So to better track and quantify actions and their effects on the atmosphere, we have a different accounting technique. And then what we call that is called impact accounting or consequential accounting. And rather than looking at how your actions as a company drive emissions into the world, it looks at how do the actions you take reduce or remove emissions that are in the atmosphere. This can happen as a result of, as I suggested, of changing suppliers. It could be the result of investing in nature-based restoration activities. You could replace or drive fuel switching to a lower carbon fuel in a particular part of your practice. There's myriad ways that you can undertake activities that would reduce or remove emissions. Do those change your inventory? Not always. Is it possible they could? They could. But if we spend all of our time figuring out how to sort of reflect change in the inventory as a result of those activities, again, we find ourselves in strange accounting land because the metrics that we use and the techniques we use to do that accounting are different. So what we found at TCAT is those are entirely legitimate actions, and they are activities that we want companies to undertake. But to incentivize them to do that, we need a separate way that they can report those and sort of tally up the cumulative impacts of all those kinds of investments separate from what they're doing to reduce their inventory. And that's really the fundamental difference between attributional and consequential accounting.
Yeah, well explained. I think to sum that up, attributional accounting is really about measuring the emissions associated with a good product or service over a specific period of time. So as you said, it's really about how do we measure the emissions that are tied to a specific thing or activity that I do, versus consequential accounting, which is really trying to understand what is the change in emissions that I am causing as a result of my actions. And so in the MAARG, we talk about this as mitigation actions and mitigation outcomes. And in order to qualify as a mitigation action and outcome, you have to pass something called the mitigation action test, which is, am I doing something differently than I otherwise would have done in order to reduce emissions? And the impact of that action can show up in your inventory in your attributional accounting system. So maybe I went from a steel emitter that emitted 10 and had an emissions factor of 10 to a steel producer that had an emissions factor of 5. And so I'm reflecting a reduction of 5 in my inventory versus a consequential approach where we say, okay, I'm implementing control technology at a steel factory, and that control technology is going to result in an emissions reduction of 5 tons because the steel factory was emitting 10 and now it's emitting 5. And so those two systems are complementary. They result in different units of measure, which I think is where we get tripped up a lot because attributional accounting is typically expressed in emissions factors. So an emissions intensity per unit of good product or service versus consequential, which are really expressed in absolute tons of outcome, either emissions reduced or removed. And that, of course, has been most famously and sort of officially codified through the carbon markets over many years. But as more companies are seeking to take action, and I think as we're really trying to prioritize and incentivize companies to do that deep decarbonization across their supply chains, we're having a little bit of a translation problem, which is that not everything in the consequential world shows up neatly in the inventory accounting systems that we use. So another way to say that is not all the things we're doing to reduce emissions in the world are going to naturally show up inside of the inventory accounting systems we have today. And so a lot of the work that I think TCAT is doing, that the Actions and Market Instruments is doing, that the AIM platform is doing, is really that translation exercise, is how do we make these systems talk to each other, and what is the Swift code for translating between what are right now highly related and adjacent accounting exercises that tell you slightly different things. And that's where I think a lot of the confusion has come in. And I think that's also where a lot of the work of the next kind of 12 to 18 months for the entire space sits, which is how do we do that translation exercise in a way that is credible, is transparent, and ensures that we're not incentivizing one accounting approach over another in a way that results in further opportunities for greenwashing or poor accounting or poor governance. So I want to talk for a minute about the energy attribute or environmental attribute certificate and commodity space. So the things that we're doing that are showing up in our supply chains, and the kind of historic carbon credit world, and the fact that those are two different instruments and expressions that help us do different things, but ultimately are all intended to help us channel finance into deep decarbonization of supply chains and reducing atmospheric emissions, because that, of course, is the ledger that matters the most at the end of the day. So let's talk a little more about multi-ledger reporting and impacts and why having multiple ledgers is so important. I think this is one of these things that's under very active debate right now. We touched on it earlier, but just help our listeners understand the value of having different reporting statements and especially why we might need additional reporting statements beyond just things in your inventory and things outside of your inventory.
Yeah, so we've talked about those different accounting techniques and how they're sort of aimed at doing different things. They're designed for both different types of activities. They reflect different kinds of things that a company might be doing. And by enabling companies to account for their activities using both of those techniques, we open up the field for things that they can do and we broaden the sort of opportunity space that they have to take action. The key to making that work and to keeping the risk of taking on new activities that historically companies have been concerned might not count towards targets because they don't fit into that inventory framework that you described so well. The key to doing that is to create that clear reporting framework that allows companies to distinguish those things one from the other and to do so consistently from year to year, but also consistently across company to company. So if you have companies in different sectors that are both making some of the kinds of real world investments you're describing, the hope would be that those activities would show up in the same way in those statements. And that's the basis for that rule-making set of kind of tests that we've provided that help companies do that work. So what the multi-framework doing, which sounds sort of obvious now, right? When you make the comparison to financial reporting and the different tools that we use in that space and get away from the history of always sort of, only looking at our footprint and whether things that we're doing change that footprint or now, is it helps a couple things. It helps to distinguish what a company has done to affect change in its own footprint versus, where things have just happened that have made those changes. So it helps companies differentiate themselves. Reduces greenwashing risk by helping companies be very clear about what they are responsible for, showing their work. Part of the critique of market-based instruments in the past has been just a little bit of uncertainty about whether, double counting might be at play or whether there are sort of systems in place to make sure that those are reliable reflections of what companies have done. So TCAT helps solve that by bringing that transparency to bear. And then ultimately creating the new incentives. So they unlock that gives companies the chance to do more because they have lower risk of being critiqued or attacked for it. So that's really the benefits that we're getting out of that multiple framework, that multiple reporting statement framework.
Yeah, I think that's great. And just for the record, SBTI is the only standard-setting body in the world that's ever tried to measure progress towards climate commitments or targets using only an inventory. The UN has never done it. No emissions trading system does it. There is no other target accounting system in the world that tries to do this. And for all the reasons that we've been discussing today, it's actually really, really hard to do that well. And in fact, I think there's a potential inverse reaction to this policy in that, and you mentioned this earlier, what we end up with is everybody trying to shove everything in the inventory, which ultimately leads to less transparency, less clarity and rigor in our accounting, and much more confusion about how and where things are showing up and under which circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it leads to less impact too, which is something we should all care about. I mean, we have lots of good examples from our conversations with companies now about why that inventory only approach really limits what's possible. If you're a company with a lot of franchises or a lot of small offices that all have small electricity loads, the inventory approach would tell you to go out and find renewable energy to support all those individual operations. Companies can't do that. There is no cost-effective way to get a small franchise office to run on a renewable energy. What you want that company to do is to invest in one place at a very large scale and generate enough new renewable energy to kind of compensate for, mitigate all of its small offices. And the option for companies is not, should I do all the small renewable energy procurements or the big one? It's, should I do the big one or not do anything at all? Because it's way too costly and effective to do it in a way that would accrue back to the inventory again. And without that alternative way of counting it, and having the community legitimately say that too is a legitimate and credible investment that makes a difference in the world, companies aren't doing it. And so again, what TCAT's sort of strength and power, I think, is not judging companies on whether something that they've done warrants counting or not, or sort of meets a quality bar. It simply says that when you choose to make these investments, here's how you report them credibly, here's how you quantify them so that they can then be counted in these different ways. And that's a really important unlock that we think has a lot of potential to sort of, again, reduce risk for companies, create value where it didn't exist, and open up and incentivize more investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's come back to the sector impact statement, because I know this is one that's been hotly debated. And I think folks may not be aware that the way in which many of the inventory accounting rules for targets are being written right now, you're really only allowed to count as much mitigation or impact in your inventory as you have an emission of that type in your inventory, which on its face sounds very logical. Right? Like if I only emit 10 tons of methane, then I should invest in 10 tons of methane somewhere in my supply chain to reduce that. And unfortunately, to your exact point earlier, it is almost never economic or practical unless you're using market-based systems to go out and say, okay, I'm going to invest in an anaerobic digester to mitigate methane, or I'm going to cap a well, or I'm going to tighten leaks in the natural gas supply chain that is, serving my buildings. Any of those mitigation actions that I'm undertaking, almost none of them are going to be doable in such a way that I can cost effectively access only 10 tons of mitigations, that I can match it with the 10 tons of emissions that I have in my inventory. And so as you're looking at these mitigation options, particularly the bigger ones that are more impactful, right? A, you're going to be looking upstream. And B, you now have a quote unquote problem of over mitigation, right? Or of having invested in more mitigation than you have a place for. And so we're basically saying if you've emitted 10 and you've reduced 10, that's all you get credit for. And if you actually reduced 50, there's now a question around what do I do with this other 40 tons from the same project? And so some of these perverse outcomes, I think that these accounting rules end up resulting in work really counter to our stated collective objective of driving mitigation at scale. And so that's why we have the sector mitigation or the sector statement. But maybe I know you've been deep in the weeds on these conversations at both the GCP Actions and Market Instruments group and in some of the other fora that we participate in. Share a little about your perspective on why this particular ledger is so interesting and important.
There's so many good, I think, anecdotes and stories to try to help illuminate that. And I think your point about sort of the rules against over investing at scale are just, it's so hard to explain to people how we even ended up in such a bizarre and strange disincentive kind of a place. And just to put a finer point on that, I mean, what you're saying is in that inventory world that we've been talking about, we don't want companies to take credit for more emissions, positive good outcomes than they had negative. So this is a strange sort of conundrum to be in. But for instance, let's imagine the example a moment ago about a company that has lots of small electrical. Let's think about a food products company that makes something out of chocolate and sources lots of chocolate over the years from lots of growers, lots of cocoa over the years from lots of growers across a wide geographic region. That company wants to do the right thing. They want to invest in upstream agricultural practices that will lower carbon and do good things. Those suppliers change every year. They're all small. They all get rolled up to a larger stream. There's simply no way to track the kinds of investment that you would make. And so what can you tell a company like that? Well, if you want everything to show up in your inventory, you have to solve for that. You have to solve traceability questions. You have to find a way to link the places where you've made those investments to your suppliers so they show up in that inventory. It's not cost effective. It's not something that anyone other than the largest companies that have the most resources and the 400 people sustainability teams working for them are ever going to be able to do. So what we're basically saying is if you're a small and medium-sized company, you're off the hook. Or if you're a company that simply doesn't want to get your head into all this complexity, you don't need to bother because these are challenges that most companies aren't going to take on. Whereas if you say to that company, what are some of the larger, more effective things you can do? They can invest within the sectors that they operate in. They can work to sort of speed the transformation of the fertilizer sector into something that's greener, while not worrying about the particular place where they have made an investment necessarily links to their own suppliers and providers. What do we get out of that? We get a larger scale investment because the companies can take full credit for what they've invested in and sort of made happen. We get a much more effective and efficient accounting system where companies don't have to spend, inordinate amount of time trying to demonstrate how those data flow through to their value chain because they just list them in their own ledger on the document, on the reporting frameworks that sums up and tallies that total number of ton impact, positive impact that they've had on the atmosphere. Is that less effective? Is it less valuable in your inventory? It is not. It's still the atmosphere experiencing the same benefit. Is it a different way for a company to take credit and to make progress? Absolutely. And the debate that we've had in the community, and it's a legitimate debate, is that by creating that opening for companies to do that, we don't want to make them less accountable for changing or making more clean their own operations. We don't want this to become a release valve that they can use at the expense of doing it here. And I think there's ways to do that. Target frameworks can do that. They can create hierarchies where you have to act here first before you act over there. There's ways that we can tackle that. The way to tackle that is not to prohibit the accounting type or the reporting of those actions. It's to manage how they're done. And so again, what TCAT's doing is sort of making the space for those things to be reported so that they're credible, and then setting the stage for a target conversation that talks about how companies can then map those to targets.
Yeah, well said. Can you say a few words about how TCAT is feeding into some of the broader target standard setting bodies that are out there? And kind of there's a lot of conversations happening right now, lots of noise. And I know our collective goal is to simplify, not further complexify this space. So what's the plan for this harmonization and convergence?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I failed to touch on that earlier. I think it's a really important point. I mean, when we first launched last year, we had a lot of very understandable questions. This is becoming a very complicated landscape. Why are you further cluttering it? Why are you adding more to the clutter of all this? And again, number one, TCAT seeks to be a sort of foundation layer, right? To fill gaps that happen, kind of we felt like existed at the sort of core base level that others can build. So it's broad, but it's not tall. And so the idea is that other target standards and other frameworks can come in and sort of do and layer on and build on TCAT. More importantly, I think to your point, we do not envision TCAT necessarily as a long-term standalone new standard. We're trying to bring a practitioner's voice to the changes that are underway among the incumbent standards that the vast, vast majority of companies today use and probably continue to want to use going forward. Companies are not eager, I think, to necessarily migrate towards new uncertain standards, but they do have really legitimate problems with the existing frameworks that are keeping them from doing things. And we have a reckoning coming about whether those standards are going to sort of evolve to meet the needs of companies or be replaced by others. And so TCAT is not setting out to be the replacement, but we are trying to really shape those existing incumbents to be more practitioner focused. And we're doing so with a body of guidance that is, in fact, floor to ceiling, assurable, and ready. So it does exist as an off-the-shelf tool that could be used by a company in whole. Again, it's not our goal to do that. We really want to see the incumbent standards that are in wide use all around the world evolve to be able to accommodate these important actions. To that end, we have a close relationship with the GHGP. I participate in the AMI working group. I think, again, we're seeing a lot of great progress there. The RFI that they have on the streets that they had out this spring, which they've now just released the kind of results from, I think demonstrates a growing openness on the part of GHGP to this broader suite of tools, is carving out the space that the Greenhouse Protocol has to play and sort of doing much like TCAT has done, is establishing those core best practices of what good looks like and what right looks like so that companies can undertake that reporting with confidence that it will eventually lead to target progress and by others. And so, again, we work very closely with them. We have, I think, a really important and great operation. What TCAT can do really well, we're light, we're small, we can kind of race ahead and work on ideas, vet those ideas with a really smart practitioner community, and then bring them into that process and use them to kind of shape and help support the debate and discussion that happens in those incumbent standards. And that's how we're kind of engaging with them.
I mean, I think as we're looking ahead over the next 2 years, there is very little question that we have a lot of work to do still, that there is further harmonization and alignment. And I want to touch on the point that you just made, which I think is a really important one, which is companies need assurable third-party transparency guidance today. And, we're hearing from the companies that we work with that they really need to be able to say things about the things that they are doing in order to continue justifying taking voluntary action and engaging in these markets. And so TCAT is intended to serve as some of that interim scaffolding, particularly as we're waiting for the broader standard setting community to move through this update and alignment and convergence and harmonization process. There is no requirement that companies bring anything to TCAT. So the way that TCAT is designed to function is it's all there. It's all off the shelf. The guidance is ready to go. You can take it and use it and take it to your auditor and say, please audit X, Y, and Z statements. And we did a lot of really basic transparency stuff that, frankly, I was quite shocked had not been done before. So basic disclosure templates and tables around the various types of market-based instruments that companies are engaging in. There wasn't clear guidance on that. So we have detailed reporting tables on all of those things so that you can really understand where are the credits that people are using coming from, how many did they use, where are they showing up. And so the goal with this whole set of guidance is really to just help move the space along. And if we are collectively looking ahead and saying, okay, what does success look like in 2 years and what does success look like in 5 years? What does that mean to you, Chris, for the standard setting space and our work at TCAT?
Well, ultimately, global greenhouse gas emissions are coming down and catastrophic warming is being headed off. That's the big thing we're all here for. But more immediately, obviously, in the realm of maybe what we can control, I really think about it as carbon management becomes a value creating opportunity for companies, right? And so there are lots of ways that can ultimately happen, right? There are many pathways that, a company by reducing its liabilities to carbon-based taxes, for instance, lowering exposure to climate risks, creating an opportunity to differentiate its products and services on the basis of carbon intensity to its customers and thereby creating greater market share for itself, getting access to lower cost capital because it can demonstrate that it's a lower carbon intensity product or service. These are all ways that carbon management can lead to value for companies. And we have all those drivers in the world right now. They're just not big enough and they're not strong enough to really pull. At the end of the day, what's necessary for all those drivers to be real is a system for tracking and accounting for carbon that is credible and transparent. And as you say, provide some of that interim scaffolding on how companies can invest in carbon to create that value while we wait for the standards to sort of land some of the big open questions that they're working on. So it is a world where the landscape is simpler. So there aren't so many sort of just information, jargony complexities that keep companies from getting in. It's one where smaller companies as well as larger companies find what they need in the guidance and can take action. And it's one where stakeholders, whether the NGO communities or the community groups, have faith that what companies are reporting is credible and legitimate because they can see companies showing their work. And as a result, companies are doing more than they're doing now. That's the big package, I think, that I'm excited about.
Yeah, well said and totally agree. I think the drive towards coherence, convergence, simplicity is fundamentally important and something that we definitely have work to do still on. But I'm feeling certainly more optimistic than I was even just a year ago. And I think folks are increasingly focused on how are we building a system that is durable and sort of fit for purpose and reflects and accommodates the real necessity that the climate crisis imposes, which is all actions wherever they are in the world are playing a role in portfolios of action for companies that they're undertaking on a voluntary basis. And as we're designing regulatory regimes in other parts of the world, not ours much these days, really trying to make sure that those are doing the work that we need them to do to drive money where it needs to go, which is into scale decarbonization solutions. So, Chris, thank you so much for all of your leadership and your time and insights today. It's been a pleasure to speak with you as always. Looking forward to having you back on the pod again soon.
Thanks, Liz. It's great to have a conversation. Appreciate the chance to work with you on it. Thank you.
That's a wrap on this special episode of Navigating Net Zero. If you enjoyed the conversation, please be sure to follow or subscribe and help us spread the word by sharing this episode with your friends or colleagues. Thank you again for listening. Until next time, take good care and keep up the fight.